This is George Lucas. I'm the executive producer and writer of Return of the Jedi. Richard Marquand was the director of the film. He'd done some great suspense films and was really good at working with actors. Eye of the Needle was the film I'd seen that he had done that impressed me the most. It was really nicely done. Had a lot of energy and suspense. And these movies, by this time, had gotten to be more like television shows. The hierarchy in the way a television show works creatively is very much different than the way it works on a motion picture. The executive producer pretty much is the overall creative overseer of the project and comes up with the ideas for the scripts and works on the scripts, and the directors just try to fulfill the obligation of getting it on the screen, where mostly in feature films a lot of the creative control really lies in the director. It's not so much today as it was then, but I've discovered over the years that it's easy to collaborate with directors if there's mutual respect about what you're doing and a kind of general agreement on the sensibility of where you're going with something, or what kind of a film it's going to be, or what the tone of it is going to be. If you can agree on those sorts of things in the beginning before you start off, it works out pretty well. I actually had a great time working with Richard Marquand. He was a very talented director and a very nice guy. He'd never done a film of this scale before, with special effects and all that sort of thing. So, just as on Empire Strikes Back, I was there to assist and help and sort of give my expertise. These films are so huge that it's really hard to do it by yourself. I mean, you really need to have a lot of people to support you in all the areas. Fortunately, in this one, especially in the art department and a lot of the other departments, we were using the same group that we'd used before. In special effects, it was the same group. So it was easier for me to shorthand with a lot of people. And that became a real asset for Richard because, I could just say, don't worry about that, we'll take care of it. So a lot of the technical complications and everything, he didn't really even have to worry about. He just focused on, getting the performances out of the actors and making sure the story got told on the set. We had that cooperative relationship where if I said, just do it like this and don't worry about it, he was curious about what was going to happen, but he didn't sort of spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel or say, no, I don't want to do it that way, because, I say, look, if this is the way you do this, it's much easier. Let's just do this, because that'll all be a map painting anyway. It's very easy, especially at this stage in special effects where it was relatively new, to get hung up trying to figure out how things were going to actually come out. The only way you ever really know that is having gone through it a few times. And you can sort of anticipate where everything's going to be. A film like this operates on a lot of faith. The actors have to have faith. In this case, the director had to have a lot of faith that it would actually come together and all the missing pieces would mysteriously appear in post-production. It's the final chapter of the original concept for Star Wars. There were a lot of things that were added into this one because of the fact that by the time I got down this far from the original script, the story had become pretty thin, and I had to fill in a lot of blanks. This first whole sequence with Jabba the Hutt was more an afterthought than anything else. The original story was really about the primitive society overcoming the Empire at the end, and Luke managing to redeem his father. And a part of the script that this actually represented in the very first outline, where I had this whole story outlined, it was like the last 20 pages of the script. So I had to come up with another 100 pages of stuff to fill in the blanks and make it work, because Han Solo had become such a popular character, and I thought it'd be fun to go back to Tatooine, and I wanted to deal with Jabba the Hutt, which kind of got lost in the process. It was a much bigger character in the original script. A lot of those things motivated me to go in this direction and spend the first quarter of the movie back on Tatooine with Jabba the Hutt. As with all these movies, the original intent was to make this a very full and exotic environment that these movies would take place in. And so each film we tried to push the envelope a little bit further in terms of unique characters and, take it into a more visually exciting and unusual area. The problem always was to do that is very, very difficult. And especially before digital technology, if you had to have really exotic robots and things, they were mostly marionettes or stop motion or something of that ilk. So we were just sort of pushing the limits of cinematic technology at that point to just get, strange creatures. The first two films were pretty light on creatures. We had a little bit in the cantina in episode 4, and in episode 5 we put most of our effort and focused on Yoda, trying to get Yoda to become real. And once we managed to make Yoda work and become real, then we, on this film, tried to expand that idea and make Jabba and the Rancor and the people in Jabba's court and the pig guards and the strange droids, to make it a much more exotic environment and use them more. You know, we barely were able to put together the very first cantina scene. You know, we shot it and then we had to go reshoot it and make more creatures and reshoot it, and constantly trying to bring it up to the level that I had originally hoped it would be. And so each one of these kind of exotic scenes, there's a huge amount of work behind every single idea to try to get to the level where you can create an alien environment on the level of just not having to think about it. It's one thing to do a creature. It's another thing to do, 35 or 40 or 50 creatures in each scene. There's a dwarf in the tail, and then a couple guys on remote controls running the tongue and the eyes. And they have to rehearse to get all the movements right, so that he'll do the right thing, because they're all trying to coordinate their moves. The group came mostly out of Jim Henson's group, which is probably the best in terms of just sheer talent and skills of working on puppets and puppeting, and especially as everything has advanced to more remote control puppeteering. They were the ones that led most of that technology. A lot of these things went through a lot of incarnations. I mean, the singer originally was a marionette, could barely move, and really couldn't do what I'd wanted. Some of the other characters who were more static were able to come off pretty well, but Jabba can't really move in this one. He's stuck on a slab. Piano player and some of those people are stuck on slabs because they're puppets. And so it's as you push the technology forward, you're able to get the creatures suddenly to walk or raise their arms or have expressions on their faces. And all that took years and years and a lot of experimentation and technical advances to just be able to get an alien character to be real. In this particular case, make the tongue work or the eyes work. That was like a major breakthrough. Be able to make eyelids move up and down, and eyes move back and forth, and the tongue go in and out, and the lips be relatively in sync. And I'm still amused by people that somehow think that when you use cyber technology or digital technology in movies, it's fake. But when you look at a scene in here, like Jabba's palace, now there's some digital characters in here, but they're no more or less fake than all the other characters that are in here. I mean, is a digital character more fake than a big fat rubber character? I mean, there's nothing real here at all. And it's hard to say that, a rubber character has more integrity than a digital character. What I try to do is just make the characters become believable, so they look realistic enough to where you have a suspension of disbelief and accept them as characters, not as tricks, which is what they all are. Lando moved through into this film primarily by my decision to focus the beginning of this movie on Han Solo. Since they were pals, it was natural that Lando would be one to try to redeem himself and be there to help rescue him and redeem his reputation at the same time. They ultimately, in the original script, it was mostly Luke, the Emperor, and Darth Vader were the key elements, along with what in the original script was a bunch of Wookiees. It was a Wookiee planet. But since I had fallen in love with the Wookiee so much, when I made episode 4, I decided to make the co-pilot a Wookiee, which meant he was technologically advanced, and the whole concept originally was that the people that overthrew the Empire were not technological. So I had to reinvent a half-sized Wookiee. The Han Solo journey is a continuation of the motif of death and rebirth, which is the overall central theme of this whole series in relationship to Darth Vader coming out of his evil hibernation and being reborn as Anakin Skywalker. He's put to sleep, which is a common device, especially in fairy tales, but it's also mythological terms too, of going into a state of suspended animation, and then usually you come out rejuvenated. Sometimes it's equivalent of going down to the netherworld and coming back enlightened. In this particular case, he was just put to sleep. The difficulty of these scenes in Jabba's palace, especially with Jabba, is that Jabba can't move. I didn't have the technology at that time to make him move around, so whenever I had to do a scene, I had to plop him down somewhere and then stage the scene around him, which made for this kind of inconvenient staging in the revelation scene here of him having to be behind a curtain. Otherwise, he could just come through the door, which is what I would have preferred. But these were the days when most of the creatures were nailed to the floor. The advantage we have in these films is that it takes about 10 years to get through the trilogy. So Mark was pretty young when we did the first one, and he was a much more mature individual by the time we reached this film. It was the same thing with Carrie. And with Harrison, it didn't show up quite so much because he started out, he was over 30. But Carrie started out at 19, and Mark was in his 30s by the time he finished. So it allowed him to use a lot more of his maturity, not only in the natural telling of the story, that he becomes more mature, but he actually was more mature as an actor and as an individual. So I think a lot of his naive boyishness that existed in A New Hope just naturally drifted away by the time we got to this film. He was a much more serious person. We hadn't done a monster per se in these. We had the snow monster on Empire Strikes Back, but in a lot of cases we were sort of just moving through various genre motifs of fantasy and science fiction and having a little bit of fun. I like the idea that everybody loves somebody, and even though this was the worst big horrible monster you could possibly imagine, that his keeper loved him. And he probably loves his keeper. Another aspect of these films that sometimes gets lost is that these films are vaguely lighthearted in terms of the fact they don't take themselves that seriously. Try to be very realistic in everything, but mostly it's, to have a rip-roaring adventure and a good time. And sometimes people, try to put more into them than should be there, or write them off as of no consequence, but the reality, I think, is somewhere in the middle. With this movie, we got a chance to expand the universe a bit, see more banthas than just one or two, see them in their natural environment. There's so little time in these movies to show the environments because we're really pushing the story all the time. That it's always great when you get another opportunity to push the camera over here and say, oh, look what's over there. In the case of Boba Fett's death, had I known he was going to turn into such a popular character, I probably would have made it a little bit more exciting. Boba Fett was just another one of the minions, another one of the bounty hunters and bad guys. But he became such a favorite of everybody's for having such a small part. He had a very large presence. And now that his history has been told in the first trilogy, it makes it even more of a misstep that we wouldn't make more out of the event of his defeat. Because most people don't believe he died anyway. I had contemplated putting that extra shot in where he climbs out of the hole, but, I figure it doesn't quite fit in the end. Well, the main character ultimately that dies in this scene is Jabba the Hutt. As much as some people hate the cute little Ewoks, they love the relationship between Princess Leia and the Slug. I'm not sure we ever really did it as well as we could have, but when you have so many different pieces of action that are supposed to be happening at exactly the same moment, you get into a very complex piece of cinema, which is editing things together that you want people to read, but you don't want to dwell on them for so long that it drags down a simultaneous moment. So I think there's always a kind of super reality that gets created in a moment like this where you're stretching time and hoping that it doesn't look like that. This is something that Steven Spielberg is very accomplished at. The best project I ever worked on where that happened is in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Under the Flying Wing. It's exactly like this sequence where you got a truck full of gas and some guys loading the truck, and then you got a fight, and then you got a pilot, and then you got people coming from the outside. Then the truck catches on fire, and then it's going toward the airplane, and then the girl gets trapped in the airplane. And it's very similar to this. In that particular case, I think it's done as well as it can ever be done. But in this case, we did it as well as we could, but I always had this nagging feeling that we could have done it better. It's a very delicate balance of having the audience be able to follow it and not having it look corny. The Emperor's coming to visit the Death Star, so it was like a big parade of all of their weaponry and their troops. It's like May Day in Russia. In terms of a display of force, this is as big as it has been at this point. I was able to actually get a more cosmic view of the galaxy by bringing the Emperor into this, who, even though he's sort of the overlord of the universe, is always in the background of the movies. And this one, I had the opportunity to bring him into the forefront because it ultimately becomes a confrontation between Vader and the Emperor, which is in the background of episodes 4 and 5, but very much in the foreground in this film. Because that's what the real conflict is. The real conflict is with the real evil master, who is the Emperor. And he's referred to, but we never really get to know him. One of the advantages of being in the third act is that you get to tie up all of the loose ends, but one of the problems you have in the third act is that you have to tie up all the loose ends. So the story is pretty much dictated by everything that's gone before it. And it's really a matter of how well they're able to fit in all the resolutions and keep the story going forward. That's usually what ties you up here, is you end up with too many things to try to solve and not enough time to do it in. In coming back to see Yoda, we have to figure out Luke's training and the fact that he never finished his training, and that obviously now he's got a big question he wants answered. And there is a point where the hero has to be left alone on his own 2 feet without anybody there to help him. And you can sort of have him be in a different place or something, but at some point you have to say, well, now that all the props have been taken away, and he has to face the evil monster alone. In this case, this scene establishes that the evil monster is actually his father, and he's going to have to do it on his own, and that he's not really equipped to do it. That he was too impatient, he didn't finish his studies, and now he's going to be half-trained to face a difficult physical and emotional challenge. When I did the end of the last movie, The Empire Strikes Back, one of the issues that came up in terms of my concern about how kids especially would take Darth Vader revealing that he is Luke's father was most of the psychologists said that most kids would just deny it and say it's not true. So I had to reaffirm in the audience's mind and in Luke's mind that it actually is true, and now he has to deal with it. Going into this movie, I had to assume that at least half of the people didn't believe it. And so I had to make it a true thing that happened. Traditionally, in the original long version of the script, this is where actually Obi-Wan Kenobi dies and leaves Luke alone. There's always an advantage to the third film in both of these trilogies, the Star Wars trilogies, which is that it starts out with a young boy, naive youth, and by the time we get to the third film, he's an experienced warrior. He matured into his full self, and therefore he's always a much more interesting character because he's richer and he's ready to take on the world and his final challenge. It's one of the things also why the third chapter or the third act of a play is more interesting, is because the first one you introduce the characters, the second you introduce the problem, and the third you get to resolve everything. And this being the third part, it has all the resolutions of all the various problems that have been developed in the first 2 films. The center of the movie is a lot of exposition. It's a lot of explaining what has happened and why things are the way they are. In this particular case, there's a whole issue of Luke's sister and the fact that they were twins, and which is an element that has to be revealed, which comes in later in terms of who is the other that was talked about in Empire Strikes Back. And how could that person become as powerful as Luke? Well, obviously if they're twins, then if she were trained and she has the same abilities that Luke has, that becomes an important issue, especially in terms of resolving all the love triangles that have been going on. This briefing room scene is what we call the pointer scene. A pointer scene is where you sit down and tell the audience all the things that have to happen or are going to happen in the rest of the movie so they can follow the plot. We have to go to the castle. This is the way we get to the castle. These are the dangers that we have to overcome, and then there's the prize at the end. And there is, in almost every movie, a pointer scene where everybody sits down and says, this is what's going to happen. And in some scenes, it's just very blatant. They have a chalkboard and a pointer, and they draw a diagram and say, this is what we have to do. All these scenes are pointer scenes. You can see in A New Hope, when we did the pointer scene toward the end about the Death Star, that was pretty much the state of the art in terms of computer animation at that point. Now in this film, we pretty much have the same scene, but the computer animation has advanced quite a bit, because both of those were done through the use of computer animation. The original Death Star illustration, and in this particular, the new Death Star. Part of the advancing technology is it allows you to do more things, to have a more epic quality to things, which gets more sophisticated as you go along, both because you can master the technology and because you have a better grasp of literally just how to do things, how to get more people in masks. Because there's a whole science behind people acting in masks. They can't stay in the mask very long. It's hard for them to breathe. Some people get claustrophobic. Again, on each one of these characters, there's 2 or 3 people with remote controls moving the eyes. For every one of these people, there's probably 3 or 4 other people standing in the sidelines trying to operate them. So if you have 3 or 4 puppet characters, you have a huge number of people on the side trying to make them all work. And each film, we were able to add more and more people in because we got better at doing that sort of thing. The story progresses from being a very contained environment in A New Hope to a bigger environment in The Empire Strikes Back. And then obviously when we get to Return of the Jedi, we're able to have large fleets of ships, more exotic environments, more stormtroopers. We've learned how to build the scale up. It was still staying within our financial resources. Sort of more frequencies on the transmitters. Pushing the edge of special effects in order to tell a more interesting story, you're always sort of on the edge of having it not work. And then the whole film falls apart because it is a facade, it's an illusion. Especially a fantasy film of any kind, you're creating a fantastic illusion that people know isn't real. So you have to make it kind of super believable, even though it's impossible and can't possibly be real. We've used just about every possible special effects technique you can imagine over the years in these movies, and almost everything that is doable and has been done is represented someplace. Which is one of the reasons everybody had a lot of fun doing these films, is because there was always a different kind of effect, always a different challenge. A lot of classic situations that had to be dealt with. It was a chance to sort of do something that doesn't come up very often. The scene with the Millennium Falcon and Lando is a way of putting a little bit of an edge on the film that Han Solo doesn't think he's going to ever see his ship again, so that there's concern about something may happen to him, something may happen to Lando. It just brings up the possibility that some of the characters could be in jeopardy. The Emperor's outpost on the Death Star is a tall spire, and is reminiscent of when you see the first 3 trilogies of the Jedi Temple. In this case, the spire, there's 1 spire on the Death Star, and then the Jedi Temple's got 5 spires. But one of the more exciting parts about making films is that you come up with an idea and that you don't know you can accomplish, and then at some point it starts to come together, and you actually see it on the screen the way you thought it would be, and it actually works. That's a big thrill. It's especially exciting in the world of special effects, where it's something that just can't happen, and then suddenly you see it on the big screen, and there it is. With performances of the actors or the characters, or there's a magic that happens when you put all the elements together and they're saying their lines and doing what they're supposed to do in the right environment, and it all comes to life. It's a very rewarding feeling. The thing about Endor is that I wanted an environment that was different from the other environments, but it needed to be a jungly kind of place, a lot of growth and green, which is, the color of life. And I wanted to give it a different look than Dagobah, which in essence had the same qualities. It was swamp. It was, again, a cradle of life environment, lots of life there. But I was beginning to run out of environments. Something that was unique. The only thing I could come up with was really giant sequoias, where the trees would be so big that it would give it a different look than what we'd seen before. And the reason I was able to move on and do the first 3 films was because I was able to create digital environments. As by the time I got down here to Return of the Jedi, I just pretty much shot everything on Earth. The speeder bike chase turned into a very fun experience. I love speed and racing and chasing and that sort of stuff. This was one of those ideas I had when I was writing the script that I really wanted to do, but I had no idea how we would accomplish this. Usually I have a guess of how I might be able to do it, and I thought, well, maybe we could do it with miniatures or something. We'd figure out a way, and I just made a leap of faith and then left it to Dennis Muren to figure it out. Dennis came up with a very unique way of doing stop motion animation in the forest environment, which had never been done before. And it really created, these sensational backgrounds. And that was the biggest challenge here. And it was the one time in all these movies where I came up with an idea I didn't know that I could pull off. Now, a scene like this with digital technology would be very easy to do. But in those days, it was, next to impossible. We started with the Ewoks, who were in the original screenplay Wookiees, that I couldn't use because I just established that Wookiees were a technologically advanced group of creatures. I needed to come up with a primitive creature that was still using sticks and stones and spears for weapons and lived in a primitive society that would be forced to take on the highly technological empire. So ultimately, I decided to keep the characters sort of fuzzy and hairy, but instead of having long hair, I gave them short hair, and instead of making them tall, I made them short. So we had a lot of little people that we put in costumes, and again, the technology is limited of what we can do to create these kind of creatures and make them real. Mostly it depends on the personality of the actor inside the suit. And I was fortunate to find this one Ewok, this little boy, Warwick Davis, who was so expressive in his suit and had such personality, the way he walked and the way he carried himself, the way he was able to act. I mean, he really was 100% into the character. Again, the challenge of creating a likable character out of a kid in a bear suit that actually has a personality as a character, isn't just somebody who's there, is very difficult. You're always pushed to how far can you go in having strange creatures, exotic creatures, who are actual characters in the movie, using this kind of, real technology of a real puppet or a real person in a suit, which is about all we had in those days. It was very limiting. Warwick was so good in this that I had been thinking about doing another kind of more traditional fantasy that involved little people, and got him to star in that. And he's done a lot of roles since. But the film was Willow, directed by Ron Howard. So now as we get into the last reels here of the film, we're into the pulling the plot together, which ultimately is the trap that the rebels are falling into, the trap that Luke is falling into, the trap that the Emperor has been planning to do away with all his enemies. So now this takes all of the dominoes that have been set up in A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back in the first part of this film and starts to tip them over, which in this particular case is reasonably complicated because we have three different stories going on simultaneously. One is in outer space with Lando and the spaceships trying to get into the Death Star. One is on the planet with Han Solo and Princess Leia trying to destroy the force field that protects the Death Star. And then you have Luke Skywalker on the Death Star confronting his father and the evil head of the Galactic Empire. I do like to tell a lot of different stories and cut back and forth. I'm not a big linear storyteller. American Graffiti, there were 4 different stories being told simultaneously. At the end, they were all sort of going very fast. I like simultaneity and jumping back and forth. It's what I'm most comfortable with, for whatever reason. Well, my first film, THX, wasn't like that. It was completely linear. Didn't cut back and forth with anything. But after that, I changed my mind. There was a big challenge with these Ewoks to make them realistic and believable. It was very hard to get much movement in the face or much individuality so you could recognize them as different characters and to believe that they were threatening at all. And they're designed to be kind of cute and fuzzy little teddy bears. I mean, they are the ones that save the day in the end. And so they had to have this dual capacity, one to be kind of cute and inconsequential, and then at the same time at the very end to be tough enough to conduct a war that you'd believe that they could actually do it. Because I knew there would be a lot of, especially older kids, that would just have a hard time buying into this idea. But we decided to do it anyway. Because we had so many Ewoks in this film, we couldn't really do remote control eyes and eyelids because we just didn't have enough remote control mechanisms. And we couldn't make their mouths move. So the actors had to make the mouths move just by moving their jaw. And actually, Warwick Davis got very good at using his tongue and sticking his tongue out a lot and sort of moving it around. So it really gave the sense that the lips were moving and that something was going on there. And all it really was him sticking his tongue out. But I think there's an impression that the mouths move, even though they actually don't. Some of the actors got pretty good at moving their jaw, but it was very hard to do and it was very tiresome. If we were doing it today, we'd have a lot more detail in the Ewoks. I think we'd probably do it digitally. We'd have a couple of suits for the lead characters, probably. Most of the other ones would be done digitally. We're coping with that now with Wookiees, because there's a lot of Wookiees in the next movie, and it's the same problem we had here. You know, where do you get enough people that tall? In this case, it was how do you get enough people that small? You know, if you're going to have a scene with several hundred in the scene, you're sort of very difficult to do. This, again, was one of those difficult scenes because there's a lot of exposition, a lot of things that need to be tied up and confronted and resolved, which sends the film in a particular direction that is more about explaining things than it is about drama. But there are times when the materials sort of dictate what you have to do in order to make the film work. So if you're into the movies and you're into what the problems are and who's who and what's what, then it becomes a fascinating scene. If you're looking to follow the plot and just get on with the movie, then it's one of those hard to get through scenes. It's the kind of thing you're always trying to balance in a movie, which is how much exposition do you give out? And unfortunately, I gave out very little exposition in the first movie. And so I saved it all up pretty much to the third movie. And at this point, you kind of had to tie all the ends together and have the people react to those things being tied up. The discussion here is one of those things you want to have to never write. You know, it's one thing for Darth Vader to tell Luke that he's his father, and it's another thing to have Luke tell Leia that he's his sister and that Darth Vader is his father. That really gets hard to swallow. So it's a real challenge to pull it off and make it come out with dialogue that is at least sincere and believable, with honest reactions. I mean, here you got these characters that have been around for a long time, and one's telling him that, oh, by the way, you're my sister, and Darth Vader's my father, and he's also your father. And most stories, it takes the whole movie to explain that part. You know, very carefully constructed and put together. Here I have to dump it out in one little scene. In the special edition, there was very little done to this movie. Most of the work was actually done in A New Hope, because that was the one that was made under the most stress, where we fell short of what I was really trying to get accomplished. And then by the time we got down to this movie, there was very little that I didn't get accomplished that I wanted to get accomplished. And a lot of that has to do with the fact this is a much more personal story. I wasn't pushing the envelope technologically to try to tell a story that I couldn't tell, because the real focus of this is really the battle between Luke and his father. It's the emotional core of the picture. This scene where Luke deliberately gets himself captured and confronts Vader sort of defines the rest of the movie in terms of the fact that it's not a chase or one trying to escape from the other, but it's an emotional confrontation between the two of them. That Luke isn't going to run away from him. He isn't going to fight him. You know, it's a whole different twist on where you might expect the movie might go. It becomes a direct challenge that Luke has with his father to say, I dare you. Yeah, I'm not going to run away from this, which makes it very different than keeping them as villains, or a villain-hero kind of situation. It's, we're going to sit down and talk about this. And again, on a lot of levels, there's some nice twists in their relationship and how they confront each other, but it's not just like in Empire Strikes Back, where it was actually a physical confrontation and a real, you know, cutting arms off and things like that. This is a more emotional, talking kind of confrontation. See, this film was written during the Vietnam War, where a small group of ill-equipped people were able to overcome a mighty power. It's not a new idea. Attila the Hun was able to overrun the Roman Empire. The American colonies were able to overrun the British. And that's always the same story. The Roman Empire had huge mechanical advantage and training advantage over the Huns, but the Huns were still able to overwhelm them with sort of enthusiasm and their humanness and their belief in what they were doing. And that was the main theme for the overall downfall of the empire, when it was basically overcome by humanity in the form of cute little teddy bears. The interesting part of making movies is that it's very hard to understand the amount of detail that you have to overcome in terms of making it look easy. You know, the amount of study and training and craft on everybody's part, you know, all the way down the line. You know, and if somebody doesn't do it right, their little piece right, then it instantly shows up on the screen and becomes a distraction. And the amount of just plain hard work that it takes to get to a particular point, to get the lines out right, to make sure the lines are right in the first place. You know, in this particular scene of the Ewoks jumping on the speeders, the problem of getting the Ewok up on the speeder because the Ewok was very short, and the speeder was sitting, about 3 feet off the ground, and that was taller than the Ewok. How to get him up there, just physically, make it believable. It takes a lot of scratching of heads. We actually tossed him up there. A couple of guys on the ground threw him. So there's a lot of work that goes into the design of these films. It has to do with the actual design of the frame. Color plays an extremely important part in all these films. Red signifying evil, the red blood, the red devil, the red as an accent color for the bad guys. The bad guys mostly exist in a black and white world. The good guys live in an organic world, which is either browns, light browns, tans, or greens, with the blue sky and stuff. But mostly it's, the good guys are green and brown, the bad guys are black and white. Which has to do as much with anything, it really has to do with that feeling, a philosophical feeling of a world of absolutes. Mechanical world where things are rigid and absolute, they're black and white, as opposed to the organic world where it's more natural and right, wrong, black, white. These kind of things don't exist, at least symbolically, in that world. Things are more natural. Part of this stuff in this terms of like this, where the window looks like a web, which it does in all of the Sith and Imperial stuff. You'll see it in Darth Vader's, in Episode 4, the TIE fighters have that same motif. It's a motif we carry through for the bad guy. But, it's designed really just to give you that feeling. It's, again, a symbolic motif that goes through that allows, say, these are bad guys. These are the people you have to be afraid of. And he is the spider luring the flies into his web, because he's the plotter. He's the devious one. In the original screenplay, this was the attack. There was a Wookiee planet, and the end with the Death Star and the Wookiee attack was all together at the end of the movie. But then when I went and did only the first movie, I kind of took the Death Star battle out and put it into the first movie. So that's why ultimately I had to create a second Death Star. But that was all originally, there was only one Death Star. And it all culminated in this one giant battle with the Wookiees on the planet battling the Death Star, and this confrontation with Luke and Vader and the Emperor. This is a part of the movie that was a real struggle in terms of believability. The style of Star Wars is a little bit lighthearted and doesn't take itself too seriously, but at the same time, it has to be believable and realistic that these funny little bears with bows and arrows could actually, confront stormtroopers. It's a big challenge. You set yourself up for particular characters, and when it comes time to the confrontation, you hope you've given them enough stuff to make it work. In this particular case, I think I established part of the credibility of the Ewoks by simply not having them win. Occasionally, toward the end, they start to win, but they lose so much in the beginning of this battle, and what you think is going to happen actually does happen, which is they're absolutely no match. That it makes it more believable that what happens later on as they do the same kinds of things, they start to get a little bit more successful at it. But never do they actually overcome them. It's really the battle in the sky. That is where the real battle is going on. This is really just the battle to get in to blow up the protective shield generator, which means that all the Ewoks really have to do is distract the troops, which is believable, that they can actually pull them away and engage them enough to keep them occupied while the generator is blown up. This was a chance for us to make a more complex dogfight and battle in space than we did in A New Hope, with more ships and more complicated moves. And this was taking the process of these kinds of space battles to the furthest degree I think anybody's ever been able to take them. Using this kind of technology, which is analog technology. The way these are done is they're sort of run through a printer over and over and over and over again. The more ships, the more times you have to run through. Some of the shots in this sequence took 24 hours just to run through the printer. So then you look at it, and if there was anything wrong, one mistake made on one frame, you had to go back and redo it again. And every time you did it, there was a chance that somebody, somewhere along the line, you'd make a mistake because you were trying to make sure that all of the sequences were put in the printer exactly the same way, and the same frame had to line up with the same frame. You had to do this, for all the mats and all of the shots and all of the, objects that are in the frame. And it got to be very, very difficult. And looking at dailies on some of the shots in that sequence of the spaceships got to be very traumatic because there was so much time and money invested in it. And you just had no idea whether it was going to turn out or not. Most of this sequence with Luke really has to do with making him angry and trying to tempt him to become angry. And Luke fighting that temptation, which obviously eventually he does, and then eventually again he doesn't. But that's the real tension in this whole scene is, will he become angry enough to try to attack the Emperor? I mean, what the Emperor wants basically is for him to kill his father so he can take his place, which is the same thing his father was trying to get him to do, which is kill the Emperor so Vader can take the Emperor's place. The one advantage I have is to be able to sort of follow my own muse, even if it seems contrary to what might be best for selling the movie. I've become more interested in the story than anything else. In this case, the story really is of a very primitive society, apparently a weak society, you know, who is able to overcome a very technological society. The scene where he says, "I love you," and she says, "I know," is an echo off the scene in Empire Strikes Back, where it's just reversed, which really, in a way, is closing the circle on their relationship. It's taken that long for one to say, "I love you," and then the next one to say, "I love you." But now they're doing it, which ultimately is the culmination of their attempts to connect with each other. Very slow and drawn-out process. The Emperor wants Luke to kill Vader so that he will have a new, young Jedi. You know, let's face it, Darth Vader is half mechanical. He's not nearly as good as he could be. He's not nearly as good as he was hoping Anakin would become, because he ends up in this confrontation which puts him in that suit. So he's hoping to get a new, better young apprentice in Luke. And if he kills his father, then he would take his place as his apprentice, which actually is something that happens in the next film. That's how Anakin becomes the Emperor's apprentice. There's a lot of stuff that's repeated through these movies. I mean, between this trilogy of 4, 5, and 6 and the first trilogy of 1, 2, and 3, one is of the father and the other is of the son. But there's a lot of scenes that are similar where the fathers and sons confront the same issues. It's almost the same scene. Thematically, there's a lot of things. It's like music. There's certain themes that keep repeating themselves, certain situations that keep repeating themselves. And the only thing that's different is the performance of the character and how does he react to that. The key issue in these movies is for a Jedi not to use anger when he's fighting. So the final confrontation here is primarily about trying to make Luke become angry, so that when he fights his father, he's fighting in anger, therefore begins to use the dark side of the Force, and then therefore sort of succumbs to the dark side of the Force. In The Empire Strikes Back, we had them confront each other and fight together. But in this one, Luke has become more mature, so that now he knows that he shouldn't be fighting him. That is the path to the dark side. So it's basically a confrontation between two people where one of them doesn't want to fight, and the other one keeps trying to push him into it. And then at the end, when he gives up from it and they really fight, then what's happening there ultimately is that Luke is turning to the dark side. All is going to be lost. There is another motif going. Things aren't what you think them to be. And I like constantly twisting. You know, you think he's a harmless little character, but he's not. He's a really powerful character. You think he's a giant, powerful character, but he's not. He's a nice, loving character. You know, we're constantly sort of switching the perception of what everybody is, which is one of the fun things about doing a fantasy film, is you play with reality a lot. This is one of those areas where sometimes I ask myself, you know, design-wise, what I'm doing, because I have characters like Chewbacca and R2 in a widescreen movie, which is horizontal and they're vertical. Here's another one of those examples in this scene where I've got a character who's completely black in a black suit and a black cape in a black environment. In space, in black space. So it's very hard to make that actually register. Just on a plain old technical level, how do you light something like this? I mean, normally in a movie you wouldn't try that. In this particular Enterprise, I even got the hero dressed in black, so it's all basically shades of black. Normally when you got several stories going, what you do is you take them down to the lowest point where everything is going wrong and everybody's in trouble. And then you bring everybody back all at the same time. So they all go down at the same time, they all come back at the same time. In this particular case, with this point where he blows up the shield generator, is for Luke. It's the beginning of the lowest part where he just keeps going down and down and down. And for the other characters, for Han and Lando and everybody, it's where they start coming back up again. So they're starting to achieve their goals, and Luke is actually losing his goal, which, in terms of the storytelling, lends credibility to the fact that maybe Luke is gonna, maybe they'll blow up the Death Star, maybe with the Emperor in it, but Luke probably won't survive. So that adds more tension and credibility to what is going on when you got one of your stories going out of sync with the other two. One is fading, and while the other two are doing the normal climax to the end of the movie. I'll be very curious to see all 6 of these films in order, to see how this very end works with killing of the Emperor and the redemption of Darth Vader, because that becomes more of the issue because of the first 3 films than it does in just seeing these 3 films by themselves. In the beginning with these 3 films, it appeared that the story was about Luke. But if you see all 6 films, then you realize that the story is really about Darth Vader. And we're constantly moving ships closer to ships in outer space. You get some movement out of it. That's one of the tricks that we've always been using. As a ship in space itself, there's not much dynamic because the stars are so far away and they don't move very fast, unless you're completely parallel. But whenever you're outside of a ship or something, there's hardly any real movement at all. So in order to create that move, we always put everything close to something. So there's always something moving. We're constantly playing with space and scale of things, in characters and environments and everything. I would never have made Empire Strikes Back the way I did if I wasn't absolutely confident I was going to be able to make Return of the Jedi. Because to make a movie with no beginning, no end, it was a huge risk and wouldn't work really unless there was the 3rd film to put it together and make this into a trilogy so that you could actually follow the whole story. This little scene where he burns his father's body, it wasn't originally in the script. But I decided it gave more closure in terms of Luke's relationship to his father and letting go of his father. Even though later on, as we get to the end of the movie, as he joins the Force, he is able to retain his original identity. It's because of Obi-Wan and Yoda who learned how to do that, how to join the Force at will and then retain your identity. But it was his identity as he was when he died, as Anakin Skywalker. Star Wars is one of those things that happens to you in life that you don't expect. But it ended up taking over my life, and I ended up, spending the next 30 years making these films. I mean, I love the films, but it's quite a bit of commitment to your life, I'll tell you, when you get down to the day-to-day struggle.